Emergency service dispatchers, what is the scariest call you have ever gotten? Posted this before. A 3-year-old was at a campground with her family and they let her out of their sight for 20 seconds and she wandered down to a creek and drowned. Her mom found her and her father called in. While I was getting details from the understandable distraught father, a random guy camping there was doing CPR managed to resuscitate her. I can't imagine how her parents felt, but it was like physical weight being lifted off of me. Edit. I'm police dispatcher. Edit 2. Itty grammar. I work for a sheriff's office and a good friend of mine was a dispatcher. I stepped outside one day for a smoke and my buddy was standing there shaking and crying. I asked him what was wrong and he told me that he had just dispatched a call for his best friend. His friend was a former army sniper and had only been out for a few months. He was a volunteer firefighter and was responding to a house fire, rolled the truck, and had been decapitated. Guy had 5 young daughters. I am an emergency helicopter dispatcher so I get calls from EMS in rural areas. First question I always ask is, what is the closest city to the scene? I swear 80% of these people do not know how to pronounce it correctly and 50% of them do not know how to spell it. One time this guy cut his D off on bath salts. When he came to he realized what he did and called us directly. Was a 911 operator for 10 years. Scariest is probably different than worst. My scariest was an active shooter in a high-rise. Just sitting on the line trying to give the best direction so everyone makes it out okay. One of the first calls I ever took. Woman calls up and asks about the process of filing a restraining order. She discusses how her boyfriend has been abusive and controlling. Mid-conversation the doorbell rings. She puts me on hold, opens the door and I hear yelling. Guy barges in and starts beating on her and I'm sitting there helpless listening. Because I didn't have her address yet. Luckily, I did have her name and within a few minutes we got her address and got help to her. She was pretty badly injured but lived. And he is still in jail. That call made me doubt myself and if I was in the right profession. But I stuck with it and it has been a very rewarding, though sometimes sad, profession. Not a dispatcher but a paramedic. But a man called, saying his mom had severe chest pains. So we head over to their address in a hurry. However, there was no mom. Just the caller waiting for us and then robbing us at gunpoint saying they were going to kill us. He just wanted the drugs. But was quite shocking still. Always going through my mind when entering some shady neighborhood. From the last time I answered this, a woman called, screaming her head off, that she had driven into a body of water. Her car was filling up with water. She couldn't open the door. She didn't know where she was. etc. Kid in the car. We're all going to die. Meanwhile I'm like, what the duck do I do now? Try to find out details about where she is. We know she can see a massive shopping center but it could be anywhere even remotely close to that. Local units all fan out to the different large ponds, streams etc. It could be. Call the Coast Guard and Marine support units to help. Try to find out what kind of body of water it is. How big it is etc. And she is just too panicked to answer any questions whatsoever. Managed to get the registration of her vehicle and that was it. Turned out she had driven into a flooded road. Flooded from rain. Not anywhere near an actual body of water. Absolutely zero danger of the water going past her knees. Less than. You forgot the serious tag so get ready to hear some bullet. 911 dispatcher here for a large city. I get a little bit of everything and mostly it's BS. But one that stuck with me was something recently. A man called in frantic and it was really hard to get him to calm down. He told me his 35-year-old girlfriend was unresponsive and not breathing. I immediately started giving this guy CPR instructions and he kept screaming, I'm sorry my love. Tough morning for the guy no doubt. It hit me that he could have been responsible or the last thing he ever said to her was not pleasant. Never followed up on the call. In this line of work, it's on to the next one. Too busy to think about it. I have millions of people depending on me not to let the last call affect the next one. I don't know what happened other than she was a DOA. Didn't hit me until the next day. My god. That scream was deafening. All I know is there was more to the story. I could hear it in his voice. Please. I've heard people shot in real time. Parents trying to revive their dead kids first thing in the morning. But this for some reason hit me. I worked as a jailer for a while after getting out of the Marines. We had a dispatcher who had 2 kids. Both boys, one a pose that was always in jail, the other younger, troubled and riding a dangerous line. She got the call one night that her younger son got shot twice in a drug deal gone wrong at a public park where he was playing ball. He was dead before the helicopter got in the air, most likely. The dispatch center was connected to the jail where she had to work, less than 50 yards from the man who shot her son. She was pretty tore up. Not a dispatcher, but one told me that one time he got a call from a 19-year-old girl. It was late and she was new to driving. In the US, her car slipped on black ice and went over the bridge. Her car sank in the river and she called 911 and he received it. He tried to keep her calm. Poor girl was an au pair from same country in Africa. She was crying because she was going to die in a foreign country, and to make things worse she didn't even know where she was. They couldn't find her fast enough. The dispatcher even remembers her last words: "Tell my sister I'm sorry I left." This story haunts me to this day, and I'm also an au pair. My sister works as a dispatcher. Her first week on the job, she had a man call in, saying he was going to kill himself. He told her that she couldn't do anything to change his mind. He was simply trying to let her know where he could be found. She heard the gunshot through the call. Second one, she had a little girl call in because her dad was unresponsive. He knew that CPR would likely save this man, but the daughter wasn't grown enough and didn't have the strength to perform it effectively. My sister had to tell her to leave the room, because the longer that girl stayed in there trying fruitlessly to save her father, the more scarred she would become by the experience of watching her father die. Call came in and was flagged as a frequent caller on the ass end of a very rural county. The dude was just screaming. We couldn't make out anything he was saying, but we had his address and sent every available unit we had. After a while the screaming started to die down and his breathing got very labored. He wouldn't talk to us, but he just kept muttering. After a few minutes we realized he was praying. Few minutes later deputy arrived on scene. Heard him check in on scene and also heard him on the line. First noise I heard was him vomiting. Turned out the dude had been working on his car and the lift collapsed. The guy wasn't under the car but was between it and a tree when the car started rolling. He was impaled on a branch and pinned between the tree and car. Dude lived. He's a quadriplegic but he's alive. First legit 911 call he ever made, and everyone took their sweet time getting there because it was usually nonsense. I think the most genuine terror comes from child callers. I had this 5-year-old call in that her dad was growling and wouldn't wake up. Okay, agonal breathing. Probably a heart attack, scrambling to get a confirmed address for EMS. PD dispatched to unconfirmed address. Finally confirmed the address and start giving directions on CPR. Nope, she will not touch him because she is scared, then bursts into tears. Luckily PD arrived just after she refused and they were able to do CPR until EMS arrived. Please op, I beg you, make another one with the serious tag. It's a really interesting question. Obligatory, not an emergency dispatcher. I had a conversation with one once where we discussed his craziest work stories, and his was taking the call of a man who had just drowned his 2 small daughters in a lake near their house. He had to stay on the phone with this sociopath, asking him questions about the time and location of the murders, until the police arrived to take him into custody. He never did find out if they ever found the children or if either of them survived in the end. I've come into contact with a fair number of sexual predators, child molesters in my line of work, but I never had to interact with them immediately after their crimes and press them for details. It's a lot to ask of someone. I've always had a lot of respect for emergency dispatchers and the folks who run abuse, rape, and suicide hotlines. There's a guy up here on the roof. He was wandering around in a daze and not responding to me. He's got his shirt off and he's sitting on top of the parking garage with his legs over the edge and he's rocking back and forth. He's covered in blood. Vehicle pursuits aren't fun either. There was an accident once on a somewhat busy state road here. An older couple in and SUV pulled out onto the road without seeing a motorcyclist that was going well over 100 miles per hour. He rear-ended them, died instantly and plowed through the SUV, landing halfway through the windshield. The SUV flipped a couple times and landed on the passenger side, trapping the wife. Then it caught on fire. At my dispatch center we had 3 of us working at all times, and I don't even know how many 911 calls we instantly got when this happened. Dozens. I'm sure. After I sent the FD and they got on the way. This is a rural area and this intersection was probably a good 10 minutes south of them. Some bystanders managed to get the husband out of the SUV but he died in the helicopter on the way to the hospital, I believe. The wife burned alive. Honestly, the worst part was right after I dispatched the FD. One of the lieutenants on the biggest police department in my county happened to be driving through there with his family and he called 911. I'll never forget how panicked and frantic he was on that call. I had never heard any of our officers like that before, let alone one of the administrators. We were pretty friendly with all of them, so it shook me up. After I hung up with him, I just started sobbing. My mother worked dispatch and got a call from a woman whose husband had locked in a trailer and lit it on fire. The windows had been boarded up and there was no way for her to get out. This was in the 90s, so landline and the call cut out when the cord started to burn. By the time fire and police arrived, it was too late. The best she got was from a woman who was very active labor. My mom had to talk her and her teenage daughter through delivering the baby. By the time Ems got there, they had healthy baby boy. Had to listen to a guy try and give CPR to his wife after she shot herself in the face. Luckily I worked for the police and not Ems. I was just listening to make sure the gun was secured and that the man didn't do anything crazy before my deputies arrived. I still think about that call a lot. Not a dispatcher, but when I used to work as a bouncer, I wound up calling 911 several times, trying to remain calm for an overdose stabbing shooting, and in one case a brutal curb stomping, while talking to the 911 dispatcher while everyone around me was very much not calm was rough. My own life's been saved a couple times by quick and professional dispatchers, and frankly they don't get enough love or credit. Not Ems, but work for a domestic violence shelter that offers sexual assault services. Will never forget talking to this one woman. And her husband came home during the call and she must have dropped the phone in the process, but then I could just hear her screaming and him yelling. That will stay with me forever, I'm sure. I really wish we had been able to get her help before that happened. That is the worst call I've had. But I find it so hard when children call. Just always breaks my heart. Probably the one when I was just getting off my shift. But we got a late call. The dispatcher sent me the address, which was eerily familiar. As the street approached, it became clearer and clearer that it was my best friend Bob's house I was dispatched to. As I opened the front door to his house, I realized two things. One, he forgot to lock the front door, and the second and most important of all, he forgot the Scariest tag. Not 911, but handled a phone where we directed people to resources. Had a lady call me asking what resources were available for someone who had been passed out cold on her chair for 2 hours. I told her to call 911. When I was younger, I applied to be a 911 operator for the city I was living in, Northern California. I got through most of their tests and interviews, which there were numerous. The pool of applicants was over 200 for about 8 positions. I got down to the last dozen applicants, then they played some recordings for us. The recording I listened to was a young girl calling 911 from inside a closet. She was crying and hysterical, saying that her dad was in the house with a gun and was going to kill her mom. You could hear the mother screaming in the background and the operator was really calm and collected. She got the little girl to keep her voice down and whisper and tried to keep her on the line. You could hear the gunshot in the background. I couldn't listen to it anymore. I didn't want to find out what happened next, so I don't know the outcome. I knew I couldn't handle that then. I don't think I could take something like that now. Real quick question. How TF is it already on 0 votes when I just posted it? I was an alarm dispatcher for about a year. Scariest I had was during the night shift. I had a woman whose alarm went off while she and her daughter were asleep. She grabbed her daughter and ran into her room and locked the door. She had a gun. The woman said she did not know why it went off and requested we dispatch the police. Protocol for the company I was with was for us to stay on the line with them while a seat neighbor called the police for us. About 30 seconds after we began the call for the police, she said the door handle was being giggled from the outside and stopped after a few attempts. She kept saying she was going to go out there no matter how many times I told her to stay in the room. Last 30 seconds of the call she was not responding. I hung up with her and called the police back and asked what was going on. They advised that police were on scene. Worst part about that job was not knowing what happened after we hung up. Glad I'm not there anymore. I've taken too many terrifying calls to count that stick with me every day, but I had a guy tell me one time that he was going to cut me up and put me in a stew. Not so much scary to me, but hilarious. Heard this story from a cop I knew. Guy calmly calls 911 to report a man standing on his front porch with a shotgun. Police arrive at the address provided to find a man in his 50s standing on the porch as described in the call. They take cover and prepare to shoot if man decides to open fire. Man points gun to his own face. Cops realize what was going on, but it happened too quickly for them to intervene. That man on the porch was the one who called. I worked as a deaf relay operator, 611, so we would often get 911 calls when people dialed the number wrong. We have to stay on the call and get them to 911 and can't leave until call is concluded. Guy is super tired trying to catch a few winks on the side of Interstate 5 when a car pulls up behind him and people jump out and try to get in the car. He drives off and calls 911 and the car follows. They are speeding down the road and he's giving the dispatcher the name of every exit he just passed, and he's saying the car is still behind him and at times is trying to pull side by side. He's scared shitless. I'm on the edge of my seat. The call drops. Not a dispatcher, but this was a local news story. A few years back there was a guy that was wanting to scrap an oil drum Ike. When he started cutting into it, it blew up and he caught on fire. He ran down to a nearby creek to put himself out. He passed a few days later in the hospital from the injuries. I vaguely remember hearing it come over our scanner that Ems had gotten there and some pieces of his skin were sliding off. It had to have been a horrible day for everyone involved. A little late to the thread, and not exactly what is being looked for from the question, but I was training to be an EMT, and was on a ride along. We show up to the scene and the only thing told to us was that it was a load and go, which meant rapid transport. I find the guy and he is making a wheezing noise trying to breathe. Turns out he had a brain bleed, and was having severe symptoms of high intracranial pressure. The ride to the nearest trauma center was only about 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 hours as we just tried to keep him from choking on his own vomit. With something like that, we couldn't really do much except hope we made it in time. It was definitely a wild experience for a ride along, and the craziest part was just cleaning up all the blood and vomit in the ambulance and quickly moving on to our next call. It's definitely not something I'll ever forget in my lifetime. Not really scary, but creepy. I got a 911 open line from a landline, and when that happens our computer automatically populates the address, phone number, homeowner's name, etc. Our policy is to send police for any 911 hang-ups or open lines from landlines since we have the address. So the deputy gets there, and the house is completely vacant and has been for a long time. I remember the open line being just silence, so nothing really weird there. The weird thing is, the deputy said has been there before for suspicious calls from neighbors saying they saw things in the house. The deputy told me he believes it's haunted and that's possibly the reason for the 911 open line. But who knows? A teenager bleeding out after just giving birth in the hallway and nothing I can do to stop it. Not emergency services. I was the bed manager of a hospital. I got a phone call on the major incident phone. A 12-carriage train had completely derailed and fell 20 foot down the embankment at speed. A short time later I was informed it was haulage, at which point my arsehole retracted. We would have had to use the car park which was being discussed as there was under 10 beds available. No HDU beds, no ITA beds, no neuro beds, and no beds in ortho wards to boot. One of the scariest, most memorable calls was probably when I had to stay on the phone with the father of a barricaded subject, Army vet, while they relayed to me what they were able to see through the in-home security footage. The wife of the subject left, went to the house of the father of the barricaded subject, without telling the subject because she saw him, the subject, standing over their baby girl with a gun the day before. We had to put out an all points bulletin to notify the surrounding area that he left the house at one point, possibly going to find his wife and daughter. He went back home and started tearing the house up and smashing things. I had to hear from my officers that he was shooting at them from inside his house. Eventually, we got him out without anyone getting injured. I ended up having to be on the phone for a solid 4.5 hours, unable to hang up and unable to go to the restroom or leave when my shift ended. I tried to block out the calls that I listened to people kill themselves and others. Not me, but someone that shared their story one day. They received a call from a woman whispering down her phone stating that there were intruders in her house. She was hiding down the side of her bed. They were downstairs and she was upstairs in her bedroom. She kept quiet for 10 minutes, keeping the call handler updated through whispering. She then told the handler the men were coming up the stairs. Next thing the handler hears is the woman saying, "Please don't hurt me." The handler hears a noise that sounds like a scuffle and voices but can't quite hear what they are saying. Then it suddenly goes completely silent, except there's this noise that sounds like the wind blowing through an object, followed by a quiet gurgling noise. Turns out the wind noise was the sound of the poor woman trying to breathe through her lacerated windpipe, and the gurgling was the blood forming bubbles as the air pumped up from her lungs, pushing it out through the wound in her neck. The intruders had decided to slit her throat upon finding her and then continue to rob the house. That story left me with a bad feeling for the rest of the day. I see a lot of people talking about suicides here. I've been at the job for 2 years now, and I'm not aware of anybody actively killing themselves while on the phone with dispatch in our jurisdiction. I'm sure it happens, but it's not the everyday thing like I'm reading here. First party suicides are rare because you either do it or you want help. So if you want help, you call 911. If you just do it, you don't call in and tell someone. We are also trained that we should never see it as a personal failing should it happen to us. This person had made up their mind and wanted to end their life. The call was just the last part of their plan before the action. Unfortunately, there are a lot of second party calls. My brother has a gun and is going to kill himself that don't end well. Anything I answered after 2200 during the Memorial Day tornado devastation. It started, tore through and devastated Brookville, Ohio, where I live, work as fire EMS, and is one of the many local agencies dispatched for Scary Night. Thank God for my experienced co-workers. Also sat at work and listened to the Dayton, Ohio shooting a few days ago. That wasn't very fun either. Not a 911 operator, but my mother works in a school and saw 2 kids lick each other. My late wife was a 911 dispatcher for 15 years. The 2 worst I remember her telling me of were a call she didn't answer, but was on duty during and heard the playback of. A woman called that her ex-boyfriend was breaking into her house and he then beat her to death with a hammer. All of which was heard on the phone. When they were hearing it, they weren't sure what it was but found out when the officers arrived. The second was when she was doing EMS calls. A man had recently had surgery on his legs and was unable to get up out of bed or his recliner by himself. He calls because his wife is having a heart attack on the other side of the room and he can't do anything to help her. She said listening to him begging for help was the worst thing she ever had to sit through. All the reasons I don't have the balls to be an emergency dispatcher. Duck. I don't like to share stories, but I find the best way to cope with the job is to keep work and home completely separate. I don't share Facebook memes. I don't often to go after work hangouts. I do my 4 days. Take my 4 days off. Also, to piggyback on other people's comments, no one in my center as long as I've been there has ever been reprimanded for taking a break after a hard call. It's not frowned upon and it's not even really followed up on, most times. My cousin used to be a 000 operative. One day he got a call from a 15-year-old boy screaming about how he was just in a crash and he thinks his parents and younger brother were dead. My cousin was trying to find out where he was, but the call ended with the boy screaming and silence. It turns out that a logging truck flipped and caused a pile up. The boy and his family were trapped under a few cars when he made the call. The kid saw the cars flying towards him, unable to stop, and his car was hit again. He died instantly. My cousin quit 5 days later. My boyfriend is a dispatcher. Worst one he told me about was a 12-year-old boy who shot himself in the mouth with a crossbow in an attempted suicide. He lived. Not sure how he is now or anything like that. I don't think my BF knows either. Former dispatcher, retired due to depression, but that's a whole other story. Nearly 10 years at that job. I don't remember what it's like to feel genuine joy without chemical assistance, but fortunately most of the calls have faded into a background noise of sorrow. The very first 911 call I ever heard on the job was 1 week into my employment, without any formal training at that point. Call was over in less than 30 seconds. Hello, what is your emergency? There are people in my house. Address. I hear a crackle on the phone. Line goes dead. Supervisor immediately takes over and sends out a code 3 response to the address. Turned out to be a home invasion. Caller had been tied up, escaped, got to her phone and made the call before being shot, dying instantly. Culprits were in the wind by the time cops arrived but were later arrested, tried and convicted. Not the worst thing I ever heard, if you can believe it. But considering my lack of training and experience at that point, it will always be the scariest.